Hey, welcome to Biblical Worldview. So, we are going to continue on the controversial topic regarding race. After the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, myself, and many other people were horrified and outraged. And we felt like there's a problem and we need to do something. And a lot of the answers that were given were read this book or read this book. You have to do the work. You have to understand what's going on. You have to understand your part. And one of the most highly recommended books by people was called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And so I read the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And I'm not sure that everybody recommending that book have actually read it, because it is I would not recommend it. I read it so you don't have to. Basically, after doing a lot of research on Robin DiAngelo, her, and I guess I would call her him a contemporary, Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote Stand for the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist. His book was also another one that was highly recommended. I have a lot of problems with his book as well, as these being the answer to racism or the answer to inequality. But Robin DiAngelo, I gotta stay focused. Robin DiAngelo's book is absolutely terrible. I think it's absolutely harmful to relationships between black and white people. I believe Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi are snake oil salespeople who are enriching themselves to the detriment of race relations, reconciliation, and they are hurting people and damaging people. Robin DiAngelo, I'm just going to be upfront, I believe is an absolute racist who views black people as inferior. She projects her racism onto all other white people, and that is what the book, if I had to summarize White Fragility, I would call it a projection of Robin DiAngelo's racism onto all of white people. I will give you examples of that. But basically, she infantilizes black people. She treats black people as inferior, as weak, and that it is the job of white people to protect them. And I know there's some black people in the critical race theory mold who kind of have that same ideology. I do not think this is the case. I think black people over time have been horribly oppressed and are so amazingly strong and resilient to have overcome this. I want to actually get into the book and quote from the book itself, and I will pull up slides, screenshots of the book. I read it in Kindle version, and I wrote some notes as I went along, and highlighted sections. So I wanted to share these with you as they highlight the point I make. But she also does make some good points, so I don't see this as all bad. It made me think, and that's always a valuable thing. And I think, out of anything terrible, you can always pull, hopefully, something good. So in her introduction, starting on page 1, she writes, "White people in North America live in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race, and white people are the beneficiaries of that separation and inequality." Now, she makes the claim that there's racism everywhere. The evidence of that is inequality. I do not think inequality or disparities are evidence of racism necessarily. They could be, but you have to actually dig into what that is. The idea of systemic racism is something I'll have to explore in another one. But do we live in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race? Well, what I'm asking for is, okay, what is the evidence of this? Or is that just an assumption that we should blindly and uncritically accept? It is separate. There's a lot of metrics in which our country is separate, unequal. I do not have as much money as Bill Gates. I purposely chose that example because Robin DiAngelo is going to bring up Bill Gates in a little while. But yeah, there's inequality in our country. A family living in rural West Virginia, regardless of their skin color, is unequal to me in terms of wealth and in a lot of categories. An Asian person is going to be unequal. Indians, I mean not American Native Americans, but Indians, people from India that are in America, are the highest income earners in the entire country. There's wealth and inequality by race. What are the explanations of that? That is the key question. But in here, there is just the assumption, these only the comparison of white people and black people, no other races, and the assumption of all inequality is that it is the cause of racism, and that we are the beneficiaries of that. And remember when I did the video, the first video on CRT 2 videos ago, I said that critical race theory is the idea that racism created by white people for their own benefit is the fundamental organizing principle of society. Now, I said that, that's James Lindsay. He's the one who shared that definition. But that is at its heart what critical race theory is. Robin DiAngelo would not call herself a critical race theorist. She would say she's a professor of critical whiteness studies. But that really is a discipline. She has, throughout this book, are the ideas, the fundamental tenets of critical race theory. And so let's look on page 2. She writes a big, long paragraph. Well, it's part of a paragraph. Thus, we perceive, and this is the basic idea. She's outlining the basic idea. What is white fragility? Is that white people are fragile. They don't want to be confronted about race issues or their racism. I disagree with that. I am very happy, and I think most people are happy to talk about race. I think they're happy to even have their ideas and ideologies challenged. I know I am, but she sets us up for what's called a Kafka trap. That means if you say you're not racist, it's because you are racist. So she writes, thus we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism. Now remember, racism under the CRT definition is a system. It's a system of those who are in power. So only white people can be racist because white people have the power. It's power plus prejudice. It's not what we normally think of as racism. They had to change the definition. So any attempt to connect us, white people, to the system of racism as an unsettling and it's an unfair moral offense. The smallest amount of racial stress is intolerable. Maybe for her, you'll see as we read. The mere suggestion that being white has meaning often triggers a range of defensive responses. This is a straw man. Oh, I'm never going to get through this if I don't just read the quote. It's basically a straw man is she's misrepresenting the defense of white people as fragility. These include emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal. Basically, any response you give to an accusation of racism other than agreement and assent to it is white fragility. If you're angry when you're accused of racism, if you have fear, if you have guilt, if you argue, if you ask them for evidence, if you have silence, if you have withdrawal, if you do anything else, it's because you're a racist. Reminds me of the Jeff Foxworthy, you might be a redneck. These responses work to reinstate white equilibrium as they repel the challenge, return our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. I conceptualize this process as white fragility. The white fragility is triggered by discomfort and anxiety. It is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. So within white people, there's a subconscious idea of wanting to protect our white advantage. It's a very negative view of, well, it's basically a sociological view, an atheistic view of human nature. So she writes further on, I couldn't understand their resentment. So when she would be doing, she goes around, she does training, corporate training courses. They pay her like $10,000, $25,000 a pop for her to do corporate training so that they could feel like they're on the right side. They're good people. They're fighting all the racism by hiring Robin DiAngelo to poison the minds of their people. I couldn't understand the resentment or disinterest in learning more about such a complex social dynamic as racism. So she's saying, why would white people, I'm trying to teach them about racism, why would they be so resentful? Why would they be so disinterested? And I think she doesn't understand that the pushback is not that she's teaching something or encouraging them to think about something, but that it's brainwashing. It's not learning. It's telling people and expecting them to blindly accept everything that you are saying. We shouldn't do that. People who engage in critical thinking should be able to question and push back on your assumptions. They should be able to ask, okay, you say I'm part of a racist system, give me some evidence. But asking for evidence is racism, according to Robin DiAngelo and according to critical race theorists. On page number 3, she says, over time I began to see what lay beneath this anger and resistance to discuss race or to listen to people of color. Remember, one of the tenets of critical race theory is that there are unique voices of color, this standpoint epistemology, that your truth comes from your position or your standpoint or your convergence of different axes of oppression. And so we need to listen to people of color. The problem is, she's not saying listen to black people. She's saying listen to all black people who agree with her. And she's not saying, oh, okay, I should listen to Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, Jason Riley, Thomas Sowell, all these black people who totally and completely repudiate everything that she believes and says. She would consider them to be like Larry Elder was called when he ran for governor of California, the black face of white supremacy. So the only people of color we should be listening to are people that agree with what she says. And then why listen to a voice of color in that case? Just listen to her if they say the same thing. It's demeaning. Black people are not a monolith, despite what Joe Biden says. They think differently.
What you all know, but most people don't know, unlike the African American community, with notable exceptions, the Latino community is an incredibly diverse community.
Listen, you got to come see us when you come to New York, VP Biden.
I will.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
Most appear to believe, so now she's talking about white people, and this is another tactic she's going to use. It's a straw man. It's basically she's saying what most white people believe, but it's a straw man because it is not what most white people believe, and it must be what she believes, because where else would this nonsense come from? So she says, most appear to believe that racism ended in 1865 with the end of slavery. Prove it. Who believes this? We've all been taught, even in the Deep South, racism existed. It existed through Jim Crow laws. There is still racism. Whether it's systemic or not, I believe is debatable. But there are people who are racist and believe people of other races are inferior. It still exists. I've never met or even read or heard of a person who believes that racism ended with the end of slavery. So she's setting up a straw man. She's making it up. She's a liar. She says, yet when someone lets us know that we have done such a thing, in other words, when someone tells us that we've committed a racial offense, basically I would call it a microaggression. If you ask someone, where are you from, because you're interested in maybe their culture or you want to ask them questions about it, most people are happy when you ask them. They love talking about where they come from and what their cultures are and what they're like, and I'm interested in those things. But when you show interest, you say something and somebody takes it as racist. It says, when someone lets us know that we have done such a thing, rather than respond with gratitude and relief, thank you for informing me of my racism. After all, now that we are informed we won't do it again, we often respond with anger and denial. I think the key here is that we critically think about the correction. In other words, if somebody accuses me of something, they may have a valid point. I want to be humble, and I want to think about myself. I want to think, is there a problem with me that I don't realize, and maybe I need to evaluate it. But I don't just blindly accept what somebody says uncritically. Some people are the actual fragile ones, and there's people that are looking to find offense in everything. And so if I genuinely and thoughtlessly offend a person, I want to apologize and learn, but I want to make sure they're not just being the fragile ones. She says, and I agree, I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. Well, that's her audience. That's the people reading this book, and that's the people that pay her the big bucks to speak. And so that has to be her main audience, of which I am not one. And so she finally says race will influence, she gives an example, lots of examples of systemic racism and complex social dilemmas. She says there is no, well, we'll talk about it. Race will influence whether we will survive our birth. That may be the case, but in what way is that the biggest factor? Well, it's an abortion. You would think she would be anti-abortion in this case. She would be pro-life, because race will influence whether we will survive our birth. The fact is, since Roe versus Wade, half of black babies have been aborted, have been killed. They have not survived. They have not even gotten to their birth. And so what she's saying is true, and it's a travesty. But that was the goal of Planned Parenthood from the beginning, and they're very successful. So moving on to chapter 1, the challenges of talking to white people about racism. Now, people in general, it's part of human nature to be defensive and to not want to change the way you think and admit your faults. And so we want to be able to evaluate ourselves and be able to really consider, am I wrong about this? Is there something I am missing? She says one of the things that she attacks, and a lot of critical race theorists attack, is the idea of individualism and meritocracy, that you have to earn what you get. So she kind of poo-poos this idea. She says individualism is a storyline that creates, communicates, reproduces, and reinforces the concept that each of us is a unique individual and that our group memberships, such as race, class, or gender, are irrelevant to our opportunities. Another straw man. In other words, she's making that up. That is not what people who believe in individualism, they believe that what you do as an individual is important and impactful. They're not saying that there's nothing else involved in how you turn out, that there are no obstacles, as if we're all somehow completely equal. We're all born in equal circumstances. We're not. But those things are not the most important things. The decisions that we make are the most important things. That's what I would say, especially in 2022, where there are no Jim Crow laws. Individualism claims that there are no intrinsic barriers to individual success, and that failure is not a consequence of social structures, but comes from an individual character. I would say both are components of it, but if you say individual character and your choices and your decisions don't make a difference, you're hampering somebody, you're holding them back. She says, according to the ideology of individualism, race is irrelevant. Again, that's a straw man. According to individualism, race is less important than choices, character, and work ethic. In other words, whatever your race is, if you work harder, you study more, you don't play as many video games after school, you use your time wisely, those are things that are going to get you ahead in life. Generally speaking, that is a fact. And now is where she brings up Bill Gates' son as an example. She says, on some level, we know that Bill Gates' son was born into a set of opportunities that will benefit him throughout his life, whether he is mediocre or exceptional. Yet even though Gates' son has clearly been handed unearned advantage, we cling tightly to the ideology of individualism when asked to consider our own unearned advantages. Why does she pick Bill Gates' son? Well, he doesn't have advantages because he's white. He has advantages because he's rich. Look at Sasha and Malia Obama. They have advantages due to the wealth and power of being an Obama, of being Barack Obama's daughters. That's unearned advantage. We all have different advantages and disadvantages, but what we do with those things and the choices that we make are what determine our future. She says, we also know that it is better to be in one of those groups than it is to be in the opposite. Like, in other words, to be in groups that have power and privilege. For example, it is better to be young than old, able-bodied rather than have a disability. It's better to be rich than to be poor. But what does she mean by better? They have more advantages in life. That doesn't make them better people. Ask how many, you can't compare that to race. Because how many poor people would rather be rich? All of them? How many old people would rather be young? Well, maybe not in this day and age. It would be a scary proposition, but you would love having that young body back. I know I would. How many disabled people would rather be able or have their disability cured? Now ask how many black people would rather be white. My guess would be 0.001%. I've never met a black person who said they wish they were white, and that may have been a case a long time ago. Finally, to end this chapter, she says, is it possible that because I am white, this is a good question, think about it, is it possible that because I am white, there are some racial dynamics that I can't see? And am I willing to consider that possibility? I think that is a really good point. Are there racial dynamics I don't see because I am white? I think that's one of the fundamental questions of this book that made me think. There are things that I could be missing because my skin color is the same as the dominant culture in our society, or not necessarily culture, but the same as if I grew up in Haiti and my skin was black, I would be part of that dominant group. They wouldn't have to think about what is it like being black in Haiti, because that's what people are. So let's look at chapter 2, racism and white supremacy. Now think about it. If everything is called racist and everything is called white supremacy, what does that mean for the actual racism and white supremacy that goes on? It's like the boy who cried wolf. When there's actual examples of it, people will tend not to believe it because everything is being called this. And that's part of the problem that I see. She says race, like gender, is socially constructed. Well, the fact is, gender is not socially constructed. That's something they made up. Race is socially constructed. Race is not a thing. It's not a biological thing. It's not a biblical thing. God made from one man everybody. Adam. We are all descendants of Adam. We are all part of the human race. We all have equal value and dignity as being made in the image of God. This amount of melanin in our skin has no bearing on our dignity or value as human beings. Gender, on the other hand, is based on biological reality. That's a whole nother topic. But sex and gender used to be interchangeable. You know, what sex are you? You're either male or female based on your biology. It incorporates gender incorporates lots of things, such as differences in body parts, your life experiences, such as men can't menstruate, to quote J.K. Rowling. She got canceled for that. Men cannot have babies. There are huge hormonal differences. There's differences in brain chemistry. Now, sure, within males, there is a wide range of masculinity. Those would be gender expressions. Within females, there's a wide range. There are more tomboyish females. That does not make them males. It makes them a female that has more masculine versus they're not Barbies, more feminine characteristics. This whole thing is absolutely sexist. So race is socially constructed. In that sense, she is right about that. She says the difference we see with our eyes, differences such as hair texture and eye color, are superficial and emerged as adaptations to geography. Under the skin, there is no true biological race. The external characteristics that we use to define race are unreliable indicators of genetic variations between any two people. Now, do you remember the core principle of critical race theory? It is that race is a social construct, but it has social significance. She's saying the exact same thing, but of course she's not a critical race theorist, but she is. But she's absolutely right. The external characteristics that we use to define race are unreliable indicators of genetic variation between any two people. That is absolutely true. And that's why I think Morgan Freeman was told, how do we stop racism? He said, stop talking about it.
Black History Month you find
ridiculous.
Why?
You're going to relegate my history to a month?
Oh, come on.
What do you do with yours? Which month is White History Month? No, well, come on, tell me.
Well, I'm Jewish.
Okay, which month is Jewish History Month?
There isn't one.
Oh, why not?
Yeah.
Do you want one?
No.
All right, I don't either. I don't want a Black History Month. Black history is American history.
How are we going to get rid of racism?
Stop talking about it.
Stop making it a big issue. But then if it's not, let's say if people start admitting that racism is way less than it was 60 years ago, and that it's hardly a factor, if at all a factor. There's many who would say it's not a factor at all, Larry Elder being one example. But then this whole industry of race hustling by Ibram X. Kendi, by Robin DiAngelo, by a lot of these people, they would go out of business. They would lose their money making ability. They have to keep promoting this idea. Why? Go back to critical race theory, because of false consciousness. If we believe, we have this belief that all of this oppression, that things are better, they have to reinvigorate a revolutionary zeal in people and create this great sense of oppression that exists in 2022. She even quotes Ibram X. Kendi on page 16 going into 17. She says in his book Stamped from the Beginning, he goes on to argue that if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. This is the biggest problem of Kendi's whole theology, I'll call it, his cultness. He says there are only two explanations for disparities between black people and white people. Again, he does not include any other group of people. There can only be two reasons for disparities. One is there is some genetic deficiency in black people, and to believe that would be racist. I rule that out. I don't believe that's the case. So the other option is there is systemic racism, and because of the systemic racism, there are disparities. Are there other reasons for disparities? Yes, of course. But he can't admit that these other reasons exist. There are cultural differences. Japanese children who go to school in America, on average, spend a lot more time studying, most Asian Americans do, than white people. White people spend more time, children spend more time studying than black people. Different cultures value different things. And because they have different values, they will have different outcomes. Read, and it's not a long book, but read this book. If you completely disagree with what I'm saying, or you somehow buy into this, if there are disparities, it must be discrimination or some fundamental problem with black people. Neither of those are the case. Well, there may be discrimination, but we can't look at only that. I'll spend more time on that when I talk about systemic racism. But they use these black or white, pun unintended, issues, these either or dichotomies where it has to be this or this, but they are manipulating you if you believe that stuff. So she goes on to say on page 19, but I also always knew that I was white and that it was better to be white. So this is where she's talking about she always knew that she was white and that it was better to be white. What does that tell you about her? Have you thought that? If you are a white person watching this, have you thought that you always knew that you were white? I think we can agree with that. And that it was better to be white? Because that's racist. And I wish you would unpack that claim. Why did you think it was better to be white? What was better about it? In her topic on racism, she says, prejudice is prejudgment about another person based on the social groups to which that person belongs. I would say yes, I agree with her, but it's not just a social group, but it's any group based on our prior experience with others in that group. The same way I stay away from leaves of 3 because I've heard and experienced getting poison ivy. So when I'm in the woods, if I see leaves of 3, I prejudge it to be poison ivy based on past experience and what I have learned. We all have prejudices. That's just a normal thing. And some of those prejudices exist to protect us. Prejudice is foundational to understanding white fragility because suggesting that white people have racial prejudice is perceived as saying that we are bad and should be ashamed. I think this is actually a really good point that she makes. It's foundational to understanding white fragility. The idea that we have racial prejudice is saying that we are bad and should be ashamed. We all have prejudices to some degrees, and maybe they are unconscious. Whether they come out is a separate question. She then says we feel that the need to defend our character rather than explore the inevitable racial prejudices we have absorbed so that we might change them. I think that is a very valuable point. The question is, why is racial prejudice bad? Why is it wrong to be more afraid of a black male than a white old lady? It's based on statistical facts and our body's natural urge for self-preservation. Even whether a person's white, if you see a white person walking down the street and they have tattoos, they have all these piercings, and they have a rough look about them versus an white old lady walking with a cane down the road, you're going to be a little more nervous around the person with all the tattoos, the younger person. That's just, you have statistics ingrained. The thing with prejudice, though, is we constantly override this prejudice. And that's a process that we have to go through. If we must overcome our racial prejudice, why shouldn't we overcome our prejudice against the police? I think is a valuable question that should be asked. She said, discrimination is action based on prejudice. These actions include ignoring, exclusion, threats, ridicule, slander, and violence. For example, if hatred is the emotion we feel because of our prejudice, extreme acts of discrimination, such as violence, may follow. These forms of discrimination are generally clear and recognizable, but if what we feel is more subtle, such as mild discomfort, the discrimination is likely to also be subtle and even hard to detect. I say this is true, but discrimination does not always follow prejudice. We are human beings, we have free will, and we can choose to override our prejudices and to try to judge people fairly. And I think that's generally a good thing. Prejudice always manifests itself in action. So this is a problem. She's using extreme language. Prejudice always manifests itself in action because the way I see the world drives my action in the world. That is not the case. Prove it. I read an article. Well, I'll share a link. Unless you believe free will does not exist, then you would have to say that, sure, action always follows prejudice. But it's not always true. There's an article in simplypsychology.org/prejudice.html, and it explains that it's not true. She says, given this reality, inserting the qualifier reverse, like if you're talking about reverse racism, is just nonsensical. I agree with that. You should just say racism is racism, viewing another group of people as inferior or bad because of their skin color, rather than looking at them as individuals. Well, that would be racism. She would disagree, and so would all advocates of CRT and this modern anti-racism, because they say it's prejudice plus power, because they want to absolve themselves of the ability of the sin of racism. Examples of ideology in the United States include individualism, the superiority of capitalism as an economic system, it is, and democracy as a political system, consumerism as a desirable lifestyle, and meritocracy. Anyone can succeed if he or she works hard. She is saying these are like parts of whiteness and parts of the American system. But I would say, what about critical race theory? What about anti-racism? Aren't those examples of ideologies? Shouldn't we question those ideologies? No, we are not allowed to question those. In fact, neither Robin DiAngelo or Ibram X. Kendi have ever gone and actually debated anybody with whom they disagree and had their ideas challenged or tested. They will only speak to audiences that nod and clap and agree. She says, the idea of systematically enforcing discriminatory behaviors with far-reaching effects. That's what systemic racism does, the direction of power between white people and people of color. It's historic, it's traditional, it's normalized. I would say that used to be the case, but I don't believe it is anymore, at least not to any really discernible degree. Whites hold the social and institutional positions in society to infuse their racial prejudice into the laws, policies, practices, and norms of society in a way that people of color do not. A person of color may refuse to wait on me if I enter a shop, but people of color cannot pass legislation that prohibits me and everyone like me from buying a home in a certain neighborhood. Let me tell you this, neither can white people. It's been illegal since 1965. Yet racial disparity between whites and people of color continues to exist in every institution across society, and in many cases is increasing rather than decreasing. But what you need to show, Robin, is that racism or discrimination is the cause of these disparities and not other factors. You just assume them. So, and then she talks about the idea of whiteness. Remember, Coca-Cola, I think, had a commercial or a series called Try to Be Less White. It did not go over well. But there's this idea of whiteness. Whiteness has replaced in the Bible the idea of original sin and the sinful heart of man. Basically, whiteness is the problem. Whiteness rests upon a foundational premise: the definition of whites as the norm or standard for human, and people of color as a deviation from that norm. That would be a problem, except most people think, in my opinion, I think most people think as human as the standard for being human, not whiteness. I think that's her projecting her racism again. She talks about Black History Month and that the idea of racism in the United States can operate outside white people. It's reinforced through celebrations such as Black History Month, in which we study the Civil War and Civil Rights eras as if they occurred separately from all U.S. history. I agree. All of that is part of U.S. history, and I hope it is taught as a part of history and not a separate part of it. The subtext is, this is bad. This is one of the biggest examples of her giving a straw man argument, or her having these racist beliefs, because no white person thinks about it. Who was the first Black person to play in the Major League Baseball? It was Jackie Robinson. And I think he was number, 42? There was a movie made about him. Really, really good movie. Ugh. And horrible what he went through. He's a hero. But what she thinks that most white people believe, it says, while Robinson was certainly an amazing baseball player, this storyline depicts him as racially special, a Black man who broke the color line himself. The subtext is that Robinson, let me know if this is the way that you thought before I said this. It's not. I know it's not. Robinson finally had what it took to play with whites, as if no Black athlete before him was strong enough to compete at that level. Nobody thought that. Everybody knows that there was racism in Major League Baseball that didn't allow people from the Negro Leagues to play with the white people. They didn't want the competition. They saw them as inferior. Whatever the reason was, they did not want that competition. It's because of racism. It's not because Jackie Robinson was the first one who was good enough to play with white people. I've never heard that. I don't believe you ever thought that. It's complete nonsense. So where did she get that idea? Because she's a racist. So she talks about, people of color that have been in power. Colin Powell, Clarence Thomas, Marco Rubio, Barack Obama. It's nice she includes Republicans and Democrats. They support the status quo and do not challenge racism in any way significant enough to be threatening. And I would say that's because it doesn't exist, or not in the way that she defines it. She says Obama endured insults and resistance previously unheard of. Really? Has she looked at Clarence Thomas? Has she looked at any Black Republican called Uncle Toms, called race traitors, called all sorts of sellouts and things of that nature? Try being a Black Republican and see what insults you get from the left, or any Black person who denies systemic racism. Where's the evidence that Obama endured things that were previously unheard of? Unless you just take the idea that if you disagreed with Obama's policies, it's because you were racist. She makes lots of claims without evidence. In fact, this book is not a research document. It has footnotes, but they're all to critical race theory authors, not actual scholars of statistics and data. So she says these narratives allow us to congratulate ourselves and our success within the institutions of society and blame others for their lack of success. So she's saying, we had a Black president, so every Black person has opportunity, can be a president of the United States. And I think that's true. They should be held up as examples that you can make it. Despite being born poor, despite having difficult circumstances, Ben Carson's a shining example of this. But she would rather spin the narrative that because you're Black, you are a victim, you're poor, you can't get ahead, and you need white people to help you, or you just can't make it. It's like a white savior complex she has. It follows that to name whiteness, much less suggest that it has meaning and grants unearned advantage, will be deeply disconcerting and destabilizing, thus triggering the protective responses of white fragility. So for her, she makes all kinds of claims. She's making this claim without giving any evidence other than sharing her own personal opinion on how she handles it. She says white supremacy in this context does not refer to individual white people. and their individual intentions what white supremacy has always meant. They've changed the definition, but to an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. So she has to change, the problem is white supremacy, it means something. Yes, it refers to the guys with the hoods. Yes, it refers to people who think of white people as better. Apparently, she falls into this category as she gives example after example. Wait till I get to the picnic one. She says this powerful ideology promotes the idea of whiteness as the ideal for humanity. And that, again, that's a straw man. I don't think people, well, real white supremacists think that, but I don't think most people think that. We believe that our culture and values, I hope, are superior to others. Otherwise, how could we say our cultures and values today are superior to those when we had slavery? We have to say ours, we have better values, and our culture is superior to that of the South in the 1800s or to Hitler's Germany. It has nothing to do with skin color. We have better values because we are closer to the ideal. Racism is wrong. We have overcome that. Slavery is a great moral stain and evil on our country. We got rid of it. Charles Mills, who is a critical race theorist, he describes white supremacy as the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. He notes that although white supremacy has shaped Western political thought for hundreds of years, it is never named. And then I said, why is this white supremacy? Well, this is just my idea. Why is this white supremacy rather than a general idea of cultural superiority? Why is it called white supremacy than just America saying American values are better than Rwandan values? Why is it whiteness? She says they represent power and control by a racial group that is in the position to disseminate and protect its own self-image, worldview, and interests across society. The problem is most of those people in power that she's talking about have a leftist worldview that promotes critical race theory. Naming white supremacy changes the conversation in two key ways. It makes the system visible and shifts the locus of change onto white people where it belongs. So only white people are responsible for this, and only white people are responsible for changing and helping black people. And I just say because she infantilizes blacks, she treats them like they're babies. She doesn't believe they are capable of improving their lives and making better choices without white saviors. I know that sounds strong, I know that sounds harsh, but that's what comes across in this book. That it should be called black fragility, not white fragility. This does not mean that people of color do not play a part, but that the full weight of responsibility rests with those who control the institutions. So it doesn't mean that black people of color do not play a part, but the full weight of responsibility with those who control the institutions, which is white people, which means people of color do not play a part. Complete and utter nonsense. But I will say this, I don't control the institutions, do you? Says that whites are disproportionately enriched and privileged by these institutions is also taken for granted. We are entitled to more privileges and resources because we are better people. Who believes this? Again, give me evidence of this. She says if people of color did not live in your neighborhood, why didn't they? I would say the same reason anyone else didn't. I mean, historically it might have been different, but I've had black people live in my neighborhood. There are plenty of them. So? But if they don't, it's because they didn't buy a house there. That's why black people wouldn't live in a white neighborhood. Mainly, generally speaking. Were you discouraged from visiting other neighborhoods, black neighborhoods? I mean, we're discouraged from visiting neighborhoods with higher crime and greater risk, especially for white people. In fact, I was told this in a Waterbury neighborhood. I was selling insurance. I went to a house in a neighborhood in inner city Waterbury, Connecticut, and the woman was like, wow, like, we don't get a lot of white people around here. That's a crack house right next door. There's a gang on the other side. Almost like I was kind of crazy to be there. But she's going to say that every reason that white people have for certain things is because of racism. If you don't go into a certain neighborhood, it's because there are black people there and you're afraid of black people, not because there might be higher crime in that neighborhood. She asks about honors and advanced placement classes and the lower track classes, were they equally racially integrated, as if honors and AP classes should have the same number demographic as people in the school. and be racially integrated? If not, why not? Well, I would say they're integrated by ability and not race, as they should be. She says in the US, race is encoded in geography. I can name every neighborhood in my city and its racial makeup. I can also tell you if a neighborhood is coming up or down in terms of home equity. This will be based primarily on how its racial demographics are changing. Going up, it will be getting whiter. Going down, it will be getting less white. And of course, because black people are disproportionately in poverty in the United States. You could read, for some of the reasons why, read Please Stop Helping Us by Jason Riley. She talks about a limited worldview, a reliance on deeply problematic depictions. This is a word they use a lot, problematic. Depictions of people of color, comfort and segregation, with no sense that there might be value in knowing people of color and internalized superiority. I just call BS on that, and I say that is her own internalized racism that she is projecting on everybody else. In Chapter 3, Racism After the Civil Rights Movement, she says, for example, after a white nationalist march and the murder of a counter-protester, oh, this one, the President of the United States said there are very fine people on both sides. There's a march on Charlottesville. They wanted to take down a statue. There were neo-Nazis and white supremacists on one side, and there were people who wanted to take down the statue on the other side, and they were having a lot of conflict. And then Donald Trump comes in and says there are fine people on both sides. Now, can you imagine Donald Trump, the President of the United States, calling the neo-Nazis fine people? And that's just despicable. What a horrendous racist. Except that is out of context. When you actually watch his speech, he's talking about there were fine people. There were bad people on both sides, and there were good people on both sides who disagreed about the statue being taken down. In fact, in a couple sentences later, he specifically says he's not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists. He says, I condemn them outright. Watch the full context of the speech. Don't just read this nonsense. She is lying, or she's deluded.
And you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. You're changing history, you're changing culture, and you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them, I'm sure in that group there were some bad ones. The following day it looked like they had some rough, bad people. Neo-Nazis, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them.
I had a friend on Facebook say, if you support or voted for Donald Trump, unfriend me. And I said, why? And he's like, if you're a racist, if you voted for him, you're a racist too. And I said, what has Donald Trump said or done that's racist? And this was the example he gave. And I explained and I gave him the context. And I said, you can use others as examples, maybe of Donald Trump being a racist, and maybe he is, but this is not an example of that, because he outright condemned over and over again the people, the skinheads, the neo-Nazis, and the white nationalists. And he specifically said he was not talking about those people, and so it's a lie to pretend that he was. She talks about the idea of being colorblind, using Martin Luther King's speech that my 3 children will no longer be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Well, hopefully that's something we support, but that is not something they can support, Robin DiAngelo, because that would end racism. Yeah, that pretend that we don't see race and racism will end. Well, we should try not to see race, because race isn't real. Morgan Freeman agrees. Coleman Hughes, actually, if you look up Coleman Hughes and the case for colorblindness on YouTube, he makes a strong case for this as well. People that say, oh, I'm colorblind or I don't see race, are not saying they don't see that people have different skin colors, that people don't have different cultures. They're saying that I'm not judging or separating you or treating you differently based on the color of your skin. She says racial bias is largely unconscious, and herein lies the deepest challenge, the defensiveness that ensues upon any suggestion of racial bias. I will say this, any suggestion of racial bias in me, I am completely open to, or any kind of bias or prejudice that I may have. I'm open to somebody sharing that with me, but I'm going to ask for evidence of it. And I'm going to think about it. I'm not just going to accept it. She says this defensiveness is classic white fragility because it protects our own racial bias while simultaneously affirming our identities as open-minded. The problem is she keeps assuming the bias is there without any evidence. It's her projection for her to malign all whites with her own personal racism. Ooh, okay, I gotta move on. Aversive racism. It's a manifestation of racism that well-intentioned people who see themselves as educated and progressive are more likely to exhibit. So it's unconscious. It's basically an unconscious sort of racism. I'm not racist. I have black friends, things like that. She says attributing inequality between whites and people of color to causes other than racism is an example of racism. But there are reasons other than racism that result in inequality. Just look at an example. Are all inequality because of discrimination? Well, then tell me why 95% of people killed by police are males. 95%, 19 out of 20 people killed by police are males. Why aren't they killing females in an equal measure? Maybe it's because males commit more crimes. Does that mean police are sexist, or does it mean men commit more crimes? That's attributing inequality between men and women to causes other than sexism. Use your brain. She was telling me, she's talking about a conversation she had with a white friend. So this is a great example of her racism. She was telling me about a white couple she knew had just moved to New Orleans and bought a house for a mere $25,000. Of course, she immediately added, they also had to buy a gun and Joan is afraid to leave the house. I immediately knew that they had bought a home in a black neighborhood. And I said, my comment here is, you are the racist here. It's because you're a racist that you automatically know it's a black neighborhood. She then says, rather, the story's emotional power rests on why a house would be that cheap, because it is in a black neighborhood where white people literally might not get out alive. She's the one that's reading race into this. Nothing to do with that. Then she goes on, she's sharing the story, and she says, I assume it's a black neighborhood. Who's making that assumption? Her. She's leading the witness. She could have asked, what is the demographic of the neighborhood? Or she could have even asked, why do you think you need a gun? And probably the answer would be because there's high crime, not because there are black people here. I don't think people care in 2022. It has nothing to do with race. It has to do with crime, why you would buy a gun. See, she's projecting her racism onto all white people. So she had an example experience with aversive racism. Her last academic position was in a state I had never been to before my interview. So she's having her interview. It says, throughout the 3 days of interviewing, other white people warned me not to buy a home in Springfield or Holyoke, Massachusetts, if I took the position, especially if I had children. While no one openly named race, the racial coding was not lost on me. I now knew where the people of color were concentrated in that area. So even though they didn't name race, I mean, if you just reading this, the racism really, really stands out that she would say this. It's not crime, it's because it's black people. That's her opinion. So saying that someone had grown up in a sheltered environment, she asked, sheltered from what, and in contrast to whom? Most people would say sheltered from crime in the inner city, not shelter from black people. This is her reading racism, in her projecting her racism again onto white people. Conversely, positioning white spaces as sheltered and those who are raised in them as racially innocent taps into classic narratives as people of color as not innocent, but she is reading racism into this. Why would sheltered mean white? Do they mean that? Did you ask them? No, she's just reading it that way because she's a racist. Talking about cultural racism, she's talking about polls. These polls were conducted before the presidency of Donald Trump, but as his election has made clear, we are far from being post-racial. Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo are very much against the idea of being post-racial, where we can't be over race, because if we're over that, if that's not centered as the fundamental organizing principle of society, then you no longer get $10,000 to $25,000 per speaking gig and all the power that comes with it. Look at this. These are examples in front stage settings. In other words, where white people, where people of color were present. She differentiates front stages where you're in a mixed group, and backstage is when it's only your white people together. But the white students displayed a range of racially conscious behaviors, including the following: acting overly nice. That is so racist. Acting overly nice. Avoiding contact. Crossing a street or not going to a particular bar or club. Mimicking black mannerisms and speech. Well, typically when you're around a group of people, there are subtle things you do to mimic their mannerisms. If I go to Australia, I might start talking like this. All right, that's not very good. Being careful not to use racial terms or labels. Well, duh, that just sounds like being a nice person or a good person. Acting overly nice, being careful not to use racial terms or labels around people of color. That's so racist. The adaptations produce the same outcome. People of color are blocked from moving forward. She's basically comparing these things to Jim Crow. This is wrong and demonstrably false. Jim Crow did. It was codified into law, preventing black people in the South from moving forward. It was in the laws. How is a few white people making racist jokes keeping any black person from moving forward? I mean, she's telling the black people this and wants them to believe this, but she's hurting and damaging them and giving them psychological pathologies by doing this. She's talking about going to a retirement party of a white friend. This is like the biggest example of racism I've ever, well, not ever heard of. The party was a potluck picnic held in a public park. As I walked down the slope toward the picnic shelters, I noticed two parties going on side by side. One gathering was primarily composed of white people and the other appeared to be all black people. I experienced a sense of disequilibrium as I approached and had to choose which party was my friend's. I felt a sense of mild anxiety as I considered that I might have to enter the all black group. Then mild relief as I realized that my friend was in the other group. She said she went to a retirement. First of all, I think this story is a crock. She went to a retirement party of a white friend, and she thought this white friend was in an all-black group. I mean, if it's a retirement party, maybe she worked with the person, or maybe they were just a friend, but clearly her friend was white. She identified her as a white friend unless she didn't know. So she thought her friend was in the all-black group. Then she felt relief. But imagine feeling anxiety because you're going to be around black people. That's racist. And then feeling relief when you realize that your friend's in the white group. This relief was amplified as I thought that I might have mistakenly walked over to the black party. If I walked over to those black people by accident, what could have happened? I don't know. I think of an example a year or two ago. I was hiking at Hubbard Park up to Castle Craig on a Saturday. When I got to the bottom, I noticed there were a group of people worshiping God, having a church service right in the middle of the park. It was awesome. So I went up and I joined. I was singing songs with them. I was like high-fiving them. It was a great time. Guess what? They were all black. Who cares? Our most important identifiers are not the color of our skin. Me, myself, them, we were Christians. We were united about from our worship of God. It didn't matter. Maybe their music was their expression was a little different in their worship. So what? They enjoyed me being there. I enjoyed being there. What really hit me was I walked into Staples, and this was a couple years ago, and there was a man there. It was a black man, but he was wearing a Dallas Cowboys football jersey. I'm a big Dallas Cowboys fan. And so guess what? That man was my brother. He was on the right side because he was a Dallas Cowboys fan. That was more important to me than his skin color. I didn't care about his skin color. In fact, if it was him standing next to a white person with a Philadelphia Eagles jersey, I had a natural inclination and preference for the black man with a Dallas Cowboys football jersey. It didn't matter. His skin color didn't matter. Robin DiAngelo, you are a racist. but not everybody is. She says, I have witnessed this assumption of servitude. In other words, this idea that black people are servants. Many times as I checked into hotels with colleagues of color, I have made this assumption. She's saying she made this assumption myself when I have been unable to hide my surprise that the black man is the school principal. Or when I ask a Latinx woman kneeling in her garden if this is her home. First of all, using Latinx I think is offensive because you're not using the labels Latino or Latina, which would be a woman, that they give themselves. You're putting your own and saying they should talk the way that you think they should talk. It just shows that this is racist. You're a racist. You assume that a black person wouldn't be a principal. You assume that a Latina kneeling in her garden must be the gardener. It can't possibly be her home. And although I may encounter a token person of color during the hiring process, if I'm not specifically applying to an organization founded by people of color, the majority of those I interact with will share my race. Sure. She's being racist again, though. Of course, the majority are going to share your race because we live in a majority white country. But who cares? Apparently you care, Robin. Also, this is racist because you're assuming a person of color is there as a token and not because they earned the position. She says, raised in a culture of white supremacy, I exude a deeply internalized assumption of racial superiority. And Robin, to this I say, I'm glad you at least admit it. On page 57, she gives examples, and these are often examples of what we would call white privilege. Another topic for another day, but she says virtually any representation of human is based on white people's norms and images. Flesh-colored makeup, standard emoji, depictions of Adam and Eve, Jesus and Mary, educational models of the human body with white skin and blue eyes. Well, duh, because you're in America where 80%, whatever the percentage is white people. That's what you're going to get. I bet in Nigeria, all of those things are made for dark-skinned people. Now there's the idea of what we would call gentrification and white flight. White flight is the idea that white families fled from cities to the suburbs to escape the influx of people of color. A process sociologists term white flight. Now, why would they leave? They leave urban communities to the suburbs when they make more money. That's the American dream. And guess what? Black people leave the inner city for the suburbs when they make more money too. It's not necessarily, some may because of people of color, and they would be racist for doing so, but that's just a normal part of society. Then she says on page 65, she says, in fact, the classification of which neighborhoods are good and which are bad is always based on race. And that is garbage. It has nothing to do with race for good neighborhoods or bad neighborhoods. It's based on crime. It's based on the appearance. It's based on the income level of people that live there. It's based on the schools. It has nothing to do with race, or very little to do with race. But in her book, it does, and it has to, because that's the only lens through which she can see everything. She says, if there are people of color around us, we are seldom encouraged to build cross-racial friendships. And I would say cross-racial friendships are no problem for most people unless we apply the principles that she's teaching in this book, in which they become absolutely impossible because race is all you think about in that friendship. We overthink it. That's what she does. She says, in her childhood, in my childhood, there are many people of color around me, but I knew that if I was to improve my life, I would not stay in these neighborhoods. Upward mobility would take me to wider spaces, and it has. And the same would be true of her black friends. So let's work together to offer these black kids a better foundation, better choices, and better opportunities to make these white spaces in the suburbs more colorful. That would be a great thing. But again, they're against things that allow black people to get ahead, like school choice. Rather than change these conditions so that public education is equal for all, we allow other people's children to endure conditions that would be unacceptable for our own. And again, that is because of the system that she is a part of, the liberal, the progressive system that hasn't been fixed in 60 plus years. Oh, but let's just keep pouring money into something that's failing. She said, readers have no doubt heard schools and neighborhoods discussed in these terms and know that this talk is racially coded. Urban and low test scores are coded for not white and therefore less desirable. That's racist projection once again. I think urban and low test scores are codes for urban and less low test scores, and something we want to avoid because we don't want our children to have low test scores. We want our children to do better. And a lot of it is because of behaviors in these schools. She says, in summary, our socialization engenders a common set of racial patterns. These patterns are the foundation of white fragility. A lack of understanding about what racism is. Well, that's because it's been redefined by you to serve your purposes, critical race theory. Assuming everyone is having or can have our experience. But that's what people do. That's what you're doing. That's what racists do. Robin DiAngelo, racists. When they essentialize and infantilize and then stereotype all black people as if they should all have and do all have the same experiences. And then all white people are part of this whole whiteness, white supremacy. A lack of authentic interest in the perspectives of people of color, but she's only talking about certain people of color. She has not, I bet she has not read Jason Riley, Thomas Sowell, John McWhorter's book, Woke Racism, Glenn Lowry, all these people, black voices, perspectives of people of color with whom she disagrees. I don't think she cited a single one in this entire book or responded to any of them because she can't. She says, I was raised in a society that taught me that there was no less in the absence of people of color, that their absence was a good, no loss in the absence of people of color, that their absence was a good and desirable thing to be sought and maintained while simultaneously denying that fact. In other words, she's saying, she was raised in a society that taught her, and that explains a lot, that there was no loss in the absence of people of color, that it was a good thing, a desirable thing to not have black people around. She says that's what she was raised in, so that explains why she's such a racist. In the good-bad binary, she's basically saying that basically whiteness is the standard of good and anything else, blackness or other cultures, are the standard of bad. On page 79, she says, as a culture, we don't claim that gender roles and gender conditioning disappear the moment we love someone of the opposite gender. Whatever love means, I think God defines it, not our culture. But she says, we don't claim that gender roles and gender conditioning disappear. The problem is gender actually makes us different. There are fundamental differences in gender, huge differences that make our lives and experiences very different. On the other hand, race does not, other than external appearance. Ethnicity might, culture might. Gender has many impacts on biology, your hormones, your brain chemistry. There are actual biological differences in gender, whereas in race, it's not a thing. There are none. And she even said that at the beginning of the book. We understand that gender is a very deep social construct. That's because as a social construct, it actually has a root in physiology, biology, and neuroscience, and many other things. There are thousands of differences between genders. In chapter 6, she talks about anti-blackness. It says on the macro level, that's like the larger scale looking down, I also recognize that the deep anti-black feelings that have been inculcated in me since childhood. These feelings surface immediately, in fact, before I can even think, when I conceptualize black people in general. Again, that's quite a problem for her. I don't think most people think this way. I mean, she is obsessed. She says, that is, the demand disappears unless white people need that housing because of unaffordable home prices in other neighborhoods. In that case, black people are pushed out as gentrification increases. Brooklyn, Harlem, Oakland, and Seattle are prime examples. John McWhorter addresses this example and others in his book, Woke Racism. He talks about basically you're darned if you do, darned if you don't. It's also whatever you choose, it's a binary. Whichever you choose, it's because you're racist. You've heard white silence is violence. If you don't say anything about racism, you're committing violence against black people. But if you speak, you're centering your own voice and not centering voices of color. So each way you're out. So the last chapter had complained about white people leaving the inner city because they wanted to get away from black people. That's called white flight. But when they move in and force black people out, that's called gentrification. Whether they move into black areas, it's because of racism. And if they move out of black areas, it's because of racism. She says, we see it in the President of the United States positioning the avowed white supremacist neo-Nazis marching openly in the streets, including one man who drove a car into a crowd of protesters as equal in character to the people protesting them, except Donald Trump specifically denounced those people. You could love or hate Donald Trump. I don't care. But the whole find people on both sides thing is a lie. The laments about black pathology, the criticism of black family structures by pundits and intellectuals ring hollow in a country whose existence was predicated on the torture of black fathers, on the rape of black mothers, on the sale of black children. An honest assessment of America's relationship to the black family reveals the country to be not its nurturer, but its destroyer, and this destruction did not end with slavery. So I made a note here and wanted to comment on it. You know, slavery in a lot of the past in terms of how America treated black people is atrocious and deplorable. However, it's also true, we have to look at, was that the cause of the breakdown of the black family or all of these things? No. It's also true that when the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, only 24% of black babies were born as single mothers and 3% of white babies. It's gone up in every community. This was concerning then, but that was 100 years after the end of slavery. Before, and then the government programs took over, and just 30 years later, that number for black families is up to 64%, and today it's over 72%, based on the Centers for Disease Control. With single-parent families having a much higher risk factor for both crime and poverty, why are we not telling men to be fathers to their children, and that they don't get to just knock up the mom and leave her with the responsibility? Where are feminists standing up and standing against this? So how do you blame slavery when things were getting so much better for black people by 1965, even with Jim Crow laws in the South? Both in terms of home ownership, even despite redlining, having jobs, education. And then when all that segregation and systemic racism was made illegal, things have gotten far worse. How do you explain that? You can't blame slavery, you can't blame systemic racism unless it's by the government in progressive programs. The Fair Housing Act was signed into law into 1968, and after years of discrimination and redlining, it was signed into law to make it harder for, those things made it harder for black people to own homes. In 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was signed, 42% of black people owned homes. Today that number is 41%. How did that stay the same when discrimination was ended? Well, I would say if you read the book Please Stop Helping Us by Jason Riley, it explains that the government actually hurt the black family more than Jim Crow laws and anything else. In fact, when the redlining and discrimination were legally in place, black homeownership went from 20% in 1950. It went up 20% from 1950 to 1970. It went up when those things were legal. And now it's just flatlined. So she says, white righteousness, when inflicting pain on African Americans, is evident in the glee the white collective. Again, that's the identity, the collective, like all of us are the same. We're not individuals. The white collective derives from blackface and depictions of blacks as apes and gorillas. Like, what are you talking about? This is ridiculous. Blackface and depicting black people as apes and gorillas is completely different. The first is simply like dress up. It's wearing a costume or pretending to be somebody else. And the second is absolute racism. As much as like blackface is today, it was acceptable not too long ago, even in the black community. Then she talks about the horribly racist film Blind Side with, I think it's Michael Orr and Christine Tuohy. She kind of adopts him, and he's a great football player and everything. And these are the crimes of this movie, all the racism in this movie. She says, white people are the saviors of black people. Well, Robin, I think that's what you think you are, and I think you agree with that. Some black children may be innocent, but black adults are morally and criminally corrupt. This movie supposedly advances these ideologies. Whites who are willing to save or otherwise help black people at seemingly great personal cost are noble, courageous, and morally superior to other whites. Well, it does seem like it would be a morally good thing, although this is what the sin that she herself is committing. Individual black people can overcome their circumstances, but usually only with the help of white people. This is what Robin DiAngelo is saying is the point of her book. Black neighborhoods are inherently dangerous and criminal. While there is a higher crime rate in black neighborhoods, that's a statistical fact. Virtually all blacks are poor, incompetent, and unqualified for their jobs. They belong to gangs, are addicted to drugs, and are bad parents. This is just a misunderstanding of the movie. The movie depicts the actual circumstances of a person's life. The most dependable route for black males to escape the inner city is through sports. Well, it's a good one if you can get it. White people are willing to deal with individual deserving black people, but whites do not become a part of the black community in any meaningful way beyond charity work. I would say she's sharing her own projections on this. She says this film is fundamentally and insidiously anti-black. And to that, Robin, I just say you're pathetic. So in chapter 7, she talks about racial triggers for white people, which greatly heighten white fragility. On page 103, she says, people of color talking directly about their own racial perspectives. This is a problem for white people, or challenging white taboos. I don't see a problem with that. I don't think we have such a taboo. We just want it to be open, honest, and respectful of different perspectives. Not to say that because I think this, it somehow must be true. People of color being unwilling to tell their stories or answer questions about their racial experiences. I'm sorry, if you say something happened that's racist and you're claiming that this is somehow an example of racism everywhere, that it's a systemic racism, then I require systemic evidence of systemic racism for it to be me to just believe it. I shouldn't just believe it. I should treat you, regardless of your color of your skin, as a human being, and that you are capable of critical thinking and you are capable of defending an assertion the same way a white person would. I shouldn't treat somebody differently because they're not white. Suggesting that group membership is significant, isn't that what she's saying? Group membership, according to critical race theory, is everything. Individual choices and actions is nothing. Your group membership defines everything about you. I don't believe that. An acknowledgement that access is unequal between racial groups. But she just has to show evidence of this. I believe between racial groups there is a difference in access to different things, but that is more a factor of your class, socioeconomic status, where you live, and things like that, rather than your race. Being presented with a person of color in a position of leadership, again, nobody cares about this. Republicans support black Republican candidates without any problem. Nobody cares. We all like Ben Carson. So, chapter 8, the result is white fragility. A majority of whites say discrimination against them exists in America today. Well, it does in certain ways, like in affirmative action is discriminatory against white people, and it's far worse for Asian. There's a whole Stop Asian Hate, and affirmative action, which actually hurts black people. This is horrendous. So she had a workplace anti-racism training that she co-facilitated with her interracial team, and somebody was feeling bothered by it. They were upset. If anyone's upset, it means because you have white fragility, not because you disagree or ask for evidence. You're not fully supporting everything that they say, their brainwashing session. This woman leaves the session, went back to her desk. She was upset. Apparently some of her statements and pushback had affected people of color in the room. Oh no, because of their fragility, I guess. At break, several other white participants approached her, and her fellow trainers reported that they had talked to the woman at their desk, and she was very upset that her statements had been challenged. Of course, this is how Robin DiAngelo is wording it. Of course, challenge was not how she phrased her concern. It was framed as her being falsely accused of having a racist impact. Her friends wanted, well, I mean, if we only look at impact, anybody can take anything however they want. They remove intentions. That doesn't matter what you intended. It matters what impact you had on a person. So it doesn't matter if, and that's wrong. Upon questioning from us, they clarified that they meant this literally. These coworkers were sincere in their fear that the young woman might actually die as a result of the feedback. So this is the highlighted part. Of course, when news of the woman's potentially fatal condition reached the rest of the participant group, all attention was immediately focused back onto her and away from engagement with the impact she had on the people of color. So she's complaining that this person that might be dying has attention focused on her. I mean, this is crazy. A person is possibly having a heart attack and you're concerned about the focus being on her? Why are we having this training where we teach people to be overly sensitive to every perceived slight or insult? We can get over some things. We don't have to take everything as the worst thing ever. And especially if you're a Christian, you're taught to be forgiving. You're taught to let things go. Maintain white solidarity. Close off self-reflection. Trivialize the reality of racism. Silence the discussion. Make white people the victims. Hijack the conversation, protect a limited worldview, take race off the table, protect white privilege, and focus on the messenger and not the message. And I would summarize these to say that maybe there are those who do these things. Maybe there are people who do those things. For me, I'm open to learning and criticism. I'm open to learning. I'm open to change. I'm open to realize I may be wrong. I may have missed something. I'm open to hearing that if somebody's willing to have me push back on what they say. But I also want evidence, and some claims of racism are simply outlandish. The challenge here is that it seems like DiAngelo doesn't expect people to accept criticism. She thinks you should be criticized and just accept it without any kind of evidence, without any kind of asking questions about it, and they should just accept it without thinking. Well, that should not be the case. On page 124, she talks about when the individual giving the feedback is a person of color, the charge is playing the race card, and the consequences of white fragility are much more penalizing. Notice she says this is really important. Racism is the norm rather than an aberration. That is a fundamental tenet of critical race theory. It's an unfounded, baseless assumption that you make she makes this throughout the book. It's based on Derek Bell. Racism is the norm. He writes, faces at the bottom of the well, the permanence of racism. It's not an aberration, it's just the normal state of affairs. In recognition of this, she says, I try to follow these guidelines. How, where, and when you give me feedback is irrelevant. It is the feedback I want and need. Understanding that is hard to give. It is hard to give. I will take it any way I can get it. From my position of social, cultural, and institutional white power and privilege, I am perfectly safe and I can handle it. If I cannot handle it, it's on me to build my racial stamina. And number 2, thank you. Granted, when somebody gives me feedback, even if I don't like it, I thank them because it's good. It's for me to think about. Maybe what they say has validity. Maybe it does not. But can you imagine somebody saying this sentence? It's so demeaning. It's so infantilizing. I disagree with some of the premises in point 1. I do believe it is important to accept criticism with grace and thanks. Even if I disagree, if it is coming from someone who I trust, my response should be, thank you for pointing that out. I'll have to think about that. I think that has value. We shouldn't be afraid of criticism, but we should question it. In Under Speak Your Truth, she says, I have not seen a pattern of lying in these groups. The admonition to speak the truth seems to be an unnecessary guideline. I have not seen a pattern of lying in these groups. In other words, if you're being defensive, you shouldn't question the stories of black people. But so what I would say is there has to be lying to some degree when people are screaming and crying about oppression. Think about LeBron James, who said he's afraid to leave his house because of the police. I mean, it's a performance, and this lying a lot of times is a performance. Women being afraid by being killed by the police. 95% of those killed by the police are men. Why would a woman be afraid of being killed by the police unless they're performing, they're acting it out, or they're believing a false narrative that is perpetrated by the media? She says, as I have tried to show throughout this book, white people raised in Western society are conditioned into a white supremacist worldview because it is the bedrock of our society and its institutions. Prove it. Give me evidence. White women's tears. Do I even want to go there? They were having a racial training, and this white woman felt so bad about all of the racism. She burst into tears and started crying about all the racism that was going on. And a woman of color pulled Robin aside and told her that she wanted to tell her to talk to that girl. She said, I'm in no neat mood for white woman's tears today. So after the discussion, it says, I spent the next hour explaining to a very outraged white woman why she was asked not to cry in the presence of a person of color. I just think that is terrible. When I learn something that's really sad or really emotional, I cry. That's what people should do when you feel pain. When we deeply feel someone else's emotional pain, obviously to a lesser degree than that person, we can be moved to cry. That's a normal human emotion, and it shows that we have empathy for that. This ideology just destroys relationships. You cannot have a normal relationship because all you're thinking about is how, she uses the phrase, the question is not, did racism take place, but it's always how did it take place and how did it become manifest in this situation. She says tears that are driven by white guilt are self-indulgent, and that may actually be a good point, especially when you have nothing that you are personally guilty of regarding racism and you're crying about it. You might want to see, are these tears self-indulgent? When you are confronted about your racism, you should say, I appreciate this feedback. I think that's a great point. I have some work to do. Well, we all have work to do, not just white people. We all have work to do in many areas of our lives to become better people, and as Christians to become more like Jesus. When people of color have been telling us for years, she says, how have we managed not to know when the information is all around us? How have we been ignorant of racism when people of color have been telling us for years? But the question is, those are people of color in her circles, the people of color with whom she agrees, but not the ones with whom she disagrees, because she doesn't listen to them. They don't count. She says, rather, I strive to be less white. To be less white is to be less racially oppressive. Ugh. Why not use the term less racist than using a skin color as a pejorative? In other words, instead of being less white, why not just say, I strive to be less racist? I mean, that's her problem. But then, to take your whole identity group like as your skin color and making that synonymous with racism, that's wrong. That's divisive, and it's not going to have good outcomes. So basically, Robin DiAngelo is an extreme racist who views black people as inferior, wouldn't want to go to white picnics, believes for some wacky reason that Jackie Robinson was the first black player who was good enough to play baseball with the white people. I don't know where she was raised or how she was raised, but it was clearly they went wrong with her in some way. And then she projected this racism onto all white people and realized this could be a great vehicle to making a whole lot of money and getting prestige and power without being criticized in any way, shape, or form. And if you do criticize her, you are a racist and you are showing white fragility. You're saying you don't have white fragility? Well, that's a sign of white fragility. That's called the Kafka trap. That's anything you say that can't be criticized, there's a problem with that. So anyway, I'm sorry this was really long. I actually tried to skim through it pretty quick. You could read the book if you don't believe me. It's horrible. It's divisive. It will ruin every relationship, I believe, that you have with a person of color, because that was all you will view them as that most important fundamental thing about them, and you will have to overthink everything you think and say around them. Everything is racially coded. Everything has a racial motivation. It's not a question of was what you said racist in some way, but how was it racist? It's the exact opposite of what Martin Luther King wanted. Instead of judging people by the content of their character, we have to separate everybody and treat everybody based on the color of their skin. This is not the way to move forward. This is not a Christian view. This is a divisive Marxist worldview. So I encourage you not to follow this way, not to recommend this book to people as the answer. What I would recommend, I have a good book right behind me here, if my microphone doesn't pull out. Yes, it's called the Bible.